Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. On behalf of the Stanford Historical Society, I'm delighted that you're joining us for Revealing History, Voices from the Stanford Oral History Collections. My name is Natalie Marine-Street, and I am a historian trained at Stanford, and since 2015, the manager of the Stanford Historical Society Oral History Program. I've been designated as moderator for this event, but oral history at Stanford is truly the work of many hands across the generations. And I would like to specially recognize both past and present members of the Society's Oral History Committee, university archivists and staff, and the many program volunteers who have served as interviewers, transcribers, transcript editors, advisors, and more. Many of you are in the audience tonight, and I just want to say a heartfelt thank you to all of you. And there wouldn't be an oral history program without our fantastic interviewees. Many of you are also joining us to listen to the presentation tonight, and we're so honored to have you here as audience members. Thank you again for sharing your stories with the Society and the archives. So we're very excited tonight to highlight some of the rich content from the collections for you. But I have to tell you that trying to figure out which of the incredible interviews to spotlight was not an easy task. Our oral history collections now contain over 800 interviews, and the collections are growing fast. After much gnashing of teeth, the event planning group, whom I'd like to recognize as Emma Frothingham, John Gifford, Charlotte Glasser, Michelle Marinkovich, Susan Schofield, and myself, we finally decided on a series of clips gathered around two themes. Not only do the collections have rich content about the themes, but both of them speak to important turning points or directions in a larger Stanford history. The themes we selected are increasing diversity in undergraduate admissions at Stanford and interdisciplinary research at Stanford. We're very lucky tonight to have two Stanford faculty experts with us to guide us through some of these clips and to help us contextualize them. First, we have Professor Albert Camarillo, who is an emeritus professor in the Stanford History Department. Widely regarded as one of the founding scholars of the field of Mexican American history and Chicano studies, he joined the Stanford faculty in 1975. Professor Camarillo is the author of 7 books and dozens of articles and essays dealing with the experiences of Mexican Americans and other racial and immigrant groups in American cities. His latest book project, Going Back to Compton, Reflections of a Native Son Searching for Racial Equality, is an autobiographical and a historical account of his hometown of Compton, California. And part 2 of the book contains several chapters that focus on Stanford and diversity issues. He's also the founding director of CSRE, the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity at Stanford, and a past president of the Organization of American Historians. He's a great friend of the Society and actually is one of our oral history program volunteer interviewers. And some of the clips that he'll present tonight are from a project that he was involved with, which launched in 2009, related to diversity at Stanford. We're also delighted to have with us Dr. Ann Arvin, who is a professor of pediatrics and of microbiology and immunology at Stanford. Dr. Arvin joined the Stanford faculty in 1978, one of 4 young women assistant professors to arrive at the School of Medicine that year, and we'll be hearing some voices of some of those in her cohort tonight. Her research investigates the molecular mechanisms of varicella zoster virus pathogenesis, and her clinical research focuses on the developing immune systems in young children in the context of viral infections and vaccines. In 2006, she was tapped by John Hennessy to serve as the Vice Provost and Dean of Research, a position in which she served until 2018. In that capacity, she oversaw the university's many independent labs and interdisciplinary institutes. So she'll explain a little more about what the Vice Provost and Dean of Research does, but I can assure you that there's no one better to guide us through the history of interdisciplinarity at Stanford than Dr. Arvin. All right, I just want to mention briefly that we will have time for question and answers at the end of the program. So if you think of a question for the presenters or you have a comment that you'd like to submit, just use that Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we will try to get to as many of those questions as possible at the end of the program. Okay, before we go on our listening tour, and I want to talk a little bit about the history of the program and give you a quick tour of the collections. So oral history at Stanford started back in 1978. And it was really a partnership between the two people that you see on the screen here, Fred Glover, a longtime Stanford staff member and a founding member of the society, and Roxanne Nyland, who was our then university archivist. Many of you know her as Rocky. She's an active member in the society today, and she's a very important figure in this history. Together, Rocky and Fred realized that many of the faculty and staff that had witnessed a real period of change at Stanford, from a pre-World War II period to a very active period of growth and change after the war, many of those folks were getting older and their stories would be lost if they didn't record them. So they set out to gather those stories. Fred, as a volunteer, did many of the interviews, as did other Stanford Historical Society members. And Rocky and a few other staff from the libraries and a lot of Stanford Historical Society volunteers took care of the transcription and making sure that those got into the archives. I was asking Rocky about what kind of equipment they used in those days, and she told me it was really state of the art then, cassette recorders with microphones. And for any of you that don't remember what a cassette recorder looked like or never got a chance to see one, here's the images of what they were recording those oral histories on and then transcribing them and printing out paper transcripts. And those are the materials that went into the archives. Some of the early interviews were with faculty and staff that were active back into the 30s. And something that's very interesting is many of these folks were also Stanford alums. So even though these interviews were done in the 1970s or 80s, we have testimony about student life from back to the 1920s. And a few of the interviewees were also the family members of some of Stanford's very earliest professors, including Dr. Ray Lyman Wilbur, who was one of the early presidents of the university. In the 1990s, the program was not quite as active. Fred Glover died, staff moved on, but an important thing happened in that there was a fund established in honor of Fred Glover that produced some earnings each year that could be used for oral history transcription, etc. That became very important in 2006 when a group of society members decided to revitalize the program, and they set about figuring out how to do oral history. So Susan Schofield, who you see in the striped shirt in this picture, and Pat Devaney formed an oral history committee that they co-chaired. They got training, they figured out who should be the priority people to interview, and they started doing oral history. There's a lot of oral history to be done at Stanford, however, and they realized that they were going to need more resources. So they looked for new funding sources and were really lucky to get support from both the Packard Foundation and the President's Office and the Provost's Office and the deans of several schools at Stanford. So this enabled the addition of some dedicated staff to the program, and it's really allowed us to expand our capacity and do some exciting things that we're going to talk to you about. The strong relationship with the libraries continued, and in the past decade, we've been able to digitize those cassette tapes and things that I showed you the pictures of. Those now are all digital. And you can listen to, you can watch, or you can read transcripts online, and you can go to our website to access anything in the collection. All right, just a word about the collection. We really have built a world-class university oral history collection, over 800 interviews. And here's kind of a textual representation of what's in the collection. But I just want to ask you, if you were in charge of this kind of daunting job, how do you document the history of an institution as complicated and complex as Stanford with oral history? What would you do? How would you go about doing it? And I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on that in the Q&A. Well, here's what we've done. Our main project is the Stanford Faculty Staff Project. So we're doing in-depth life history interviews with faculty and staff members. We try to interview across all 7 schools of the university and make sure that every department has at least one interview. We also are looking for staff members in key positions. So those institution builders that are in charge of different functions at the university that make such an important contribution. A history of an institution wouldn't be complete without histories of its leaders, its most senior leaders. And we're proud to have very high quality interviews with 3 presidents, 5 provosts, and many trustees. It's an area that we're focusing on, and we're honored to have some of our trustee interviewees in the audience tonight. We adopt special theme projects each year to address topics that are particularly relevant to the moment. And you'll hear some clips from some of those tonight. I mentioned the Diversity Oral History Project. You'll also be hearing some clips from the Pioneering Women Oral History Project, where we tried to get life stories of some of the women who were amongst the earliest women faculty members in their department here at Stanford. With those resources that I talked about, we've been able to move into video. We videotape many of our oral histories now in-house, and we also can do one special video project every year. So here's the panels that we've done so far. They've been really fascinating. And tonight you'll get to hear some excerpts from the early Chicano Latino history at Stanford panel, as well as the School of Medicine's move from San Francisco to the Stanford campus. All right, an oral history of a university is not complete without stories from its students and alumni. And we've been happy at several reunion homecomings to conduct interviews. These are photos from 2019 reunion homecoming. One of my favorite weekends of the whole year was talking to these folks. And we've also been able to do interviews at special alumni summits that were held with Black alumni and Latinx alumni in 2019. There's so many great ideas for oral history projects at Stanford that we've had to think differently about how to support them all. So the oral history adopts several projects each year, but we also have a suite of resources to enable community groups at Stanford to do their own oral history projects. We provide training, help with project planning, and getting things into the archives. And then we try to get people to do whatever oral history that they feel is important. So 2 that I'll mention quickly are the Movement Project, which was with alumni that had been very active in anti-Vietnam War and other activism at Stanford in the late 60s and early 70s, and also the John W. Gardner Legacy Oral History Project. Some of you might remember John Gardner was the secretary of HEW for LBJ, the founder of Common Cause and Independent Sector. He was also a Stanford alum, a member of the Board of Trustees, and spent his last years at Stanford. He's an expert in leadership studies and mentoring, and a group of people wanted to really document his influence on the country in hopes that one day someone will write a biography of him. So they've gathered testimonies from many who worked with him and were influenced by him. All right, finally, I mentioned the staff support that we're lucky to have, but we're still a unique volunteer-powered program. Our oral history committee is pictured here in the upper left, and these are just pictures of our great volunteers in action. And finally, we've been very happy to be able to have students get involved in this project and do interviews and act as interns in the summer. Okay, We build this as revealing history. So I want to just say a few words about what's revealing about oral history, and then I want to hear what you think in the Q&A. So oral history gives you a personal and experiential type of research. These interviews really are centered on the interviewee. Not every type of interview has that same spirit and ethos. Our interviews are in-depth. Most projects follow a life history model. So we're interested in not just what did you do when you came to Stanford, but what's your family background? What kind of skills and experiences did you bring with you here to Stanford? And then how did that play out in this environment? With oral history, we can provide a multi-dimensional historical record, and we've tried to model that for you here tonight. So thinking about not only how one person, maybe a leader, saw the event unfold, but how can we talk to people who were situated in different vantage points? So look for that tonight in the clips and see if you can see that multi-dimensional perspective that we're talking about. I think it will become obvious as you listen and watch the clips tonight that oral history brings with it an immediacy of hearing the human voice, seeing facial expressions and gestures that I think can just be very revealing, more so often than a written document in the archives might be. Okay, so we're going to get ready to get into the clips now, and I want you to put on your historian's hats and think about this question. How does institutional change happen? At a place like Stanford, how do you make something change? Think about that, and maybe we'll see some ideas tonight. And just listen for a few things in these clips. Individual actions, and what kind of experiences are people bringing with them when they come to Stanford, and how are those playing out here? Look and listen for networks and connections. Oral history is a great methodology for exposing those. Contingencies, chance happenings. Maybe something wouldn't have gone the same way if two people wouldn't have gotten together. And paths not taken. Also motivations. People say it's hard to ever understand people's motivations historically. But with oral history, you can actually ask somebody, why did you do it? What were you thinking when you formed that program? Narrative patterns are something to pay attention to. And finally, be on the listen for our interviewers. In oral history, we have a notion called shared authority. So this idea that the interviewee and the interviewer are collaborating in producing this story and this account. So it's not just a journalist going in to try to get a certain soundbite for their story, but they're collaborating in telling the story of a life. So listen for our interviewers. All right, I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a second, but just two qualifications. You're going to hear some really interesting clips, and our presenters are going to contextualize them, but these clips do not tell the whole story about these themes. They're just kind of a beginning of an exploration and helping to spotlight some of the content in the collections. And also, we've optimized everything for streaming, but internet quality varies, so things might not be pristine. If you experience any lag, just hang in there with us. And we promise that after the event, we will have these clips available so that you can watch them in an environment in case you missed anything. All right, we're going to cue up the first clip now. And I just want to tell you a little bit about it. So this was done at Reunion Homecoming in 2019, and it was two wonderful alums I got the chance to talk with. And we talked about a lot of things, but one of the things that we talked about was what it was like to be first generation and low income at Stanford during the 1990s. So I hope that you'll enjoy listening to this clip. We don't have images to go with it, but I'd like you to just listen for the richness of the experience that they narrate and the really interesting interchange between these two good friends as they tell this story together. Let's have the first clip.
we were talking a little bit about being first generation and low income and so forth. And for me, that was a challenge. I think, well, for one, I had never been around people who had come from affluent backgrounds, not even really upper middle class backgrounds. So it was a bit of shock when I got here and people had BMWs with their names on them.
The wealth was shocking.
The wealth was shocking.
Yeah.
Yeah. And being a student who did not have that, and I essentially, I did all my financial aid forms and all of that stuff, and I took out my loans, and I was responsible for everything. It was just very different, I think, from other people's experiences.
There was a sense you're like, I don't want people really to know how poor I am.
Right.
Because I can tell, like, I would feel out of place if they really understood how poor I was.
Right.
Yeah, that was a definitely
so,
concern.
It was that was part of me that I didn't really reveal,
yeah,
to many people. So just being here, I think people would make assumptions about who you are and who your parents are.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, like, we grew up on welfare and with like Section 8 housing and food stamps and all of that kind of thing. And while I was here, I remember sending money to my mom or buying things for her that she needed. And so it was just
different.
It was just different. And of course I was ashamed for other people to know that. Now I embrace that because it's just who I am. It's part of my story. But at 18, it's something that you're embarrassed about.
I remember being, first night, we're being in a memorial auditorium, and then the chancellor gives a speech, and I remember him saying something like, you belong, like you are selected because you belong here. Mm-hmm. And the one thing, just coming out of Stanford, I've always felt was I can do anything. Yeah. Like Stanford reinforces that with you from day one.
Yeah.
You can do anything. And so just in my jobs, in my career, I've never ever thought I couldn't do something. Like, I'm like, what do you mean it's too hard? And no, it's not too hard. You can figure it out. Mm-hmm. It's always been, and it came from just the culture that Stanford instills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important because, for example, when I was a senior in high school, I remember my English teacher telling me, she'd say, where are you applying? And I told her where I was applying. And she said, Stanford, why are you applying there? You're going to take somebody else's spot. And so coming from a place, from there, and then being able to come here and be successful and do it, it's just like, it's amazing. It's awesome. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So everybody, welcome. Thank you for joining us for this program this afternoon. I wish we could be in one of our beautiful lecture halls so I could see you. I could see old friends because I know there's some of you out there. But alas, in this crazy world of COVID-19 pandemic, we have to rely on technology. Sometimes it goes awry, but most of the time it works. And this is a shout out to the Stanford Video Service of Professional Amy and Ryan who are helping us with this program. I want to start first by commending the Stanford Historical Society's Oral History Program for the important contributions, truly invaluable contributions it's made and continues to make in preserving the historical record of the university through its recording of oral testimonies. And I want to especially thank Natalie because she's brought a new vitality and sense of purpose to the program that others had built in years past. But it's become such, I think, a profound resource. And adding on to what Natalie said previously, the value of oral history to the archival record is enormously important for writing historical narratives. As a historian, it provides, for me, when I use this kind of material, it provides the personal perspective that augments the written documents that historians typically use. They add richness and context and texture that traditional sources such as newspapers and letters and memos and email just don't provide. Do any of you remember a memo? I haven't written a memo in probably 30 years, actually, thank goodness. But they are part of the record. But oral history brings these things to life. Now, the video clips we will view the first half of our program this afternoon focuses on a variety of issues related to Stanford's efforts to transform itself from a predominantly white university to a multiracial, multicultural institution. And in beginning in the late 1960s, the university struggled to figure out how to begin to diversify its undergraduate student body. And the first years of federal affirmative action mandates, this was under the Johnson administration Great Society efforts, it mandated institutions to begin to admit underrepresented minorities to universities across the land. But this proved to be enormously challenging for every university across the land. Change was sometimes prodded by students of color and sometimes by policy decisions made by the faculty and administrators, and often by both. Efforts to diversify the undergraduate population at Stanford were always difficult. It was difficult for the students, it was difficult for the staff, it was difficult for the faculty. There were no simple ways to make changes to university admissions policies, and adjustments to student services at Stanford struggled to advance the cause of educational opportunity for groups that had been largely shut out of the university for generations, for Stanford, pretty much from its inception, with some exceptions. So the stories you will hear today about diversifying the student body are Stanford stories, but they are not unique. They are part of a larger national story of higher education from the 1960s to the present. And that history, believe me, is quite remarkable. It is, in fact, nothing short of a transformation of colleges and universities trying to be better institutions. I was both participant and observer of those changes for the last 50 years, starting at UCLA as a student and for 43 years on the faculty at Stanford. But the Stanford story is truly a remarkable one, because over the course of about 4 decades, Stanford did indeed transform the composition of its undergraduate population. It is a story about societal and institutional change. It's a story about opening up opportunity for people who never had such any chance, any thought of attending Stanford before about 1970. It's a story about how a university and its various programs, its departments, its student services change. It's a story about how students adjust to a new environment, how faculty and staff adjust with them. It's a story about some unsung heroes. You're going to hear about a couple of these from these people today. And these are people that promoted diversity with integrity because they knew it was the right thing to do for Stanford and for American society. It is a story clearly about struggle and anguish, often anguish. You heard some of that anguish in that previous clip. But beautifully, it's a story about success and progress. Now, the oral history clips we share with you today tell part of the story, not all of the story. You'd have to dig into them further. But they are part of the archival record of the university and truly a treasure trove, a wonderfully rich resource for telling a hugely important part of Stanford's history in the second half of the 20th century. Now, I will personally rely on these incredibly valuable sources as I tell a story about my 43 years as a Stanford faculty member and the efforts to diversify the student body and the faculty in the book that Natalie mentioned. And so I will be digging further into the sources, some of which you are seeing, we'll see this afternoon. Now, the first clips we are going to show you, we can refer to them as origin stories. They're told by 3 different participants as Stanford begins to launch efforts to diversify its student body. The first of these clips is the now famous Taking the Mic, a protest by the Black Student Union in 1968. And this will be a reflection of those people who participated in taking the mic 50 years later and reflecting on the impact that they in fact had at this university. That'll be followed by remarks by Ray Bacchetti as a staff member remembering that event and the consequences of that event and how the university responded. And the third part of the clip features Artie Bienenstock, a good friend and colleague, who was a faculty member tasked by the administration of the university in those early days to come up with the best approach for admitting more students of color. So with that, let's see our first few clips.
The Black Student Union had discussed and presented demands or recommendations to the university in the fall of '67. And the university basically ignored those recommendations. And so once the assassination occurred, we had a deeper dive into the issues that we were experiencing on the university and created a list of 40 to 50 demands or things that we wanted changed. One of the co-chairs of the BSU, before he came to Stanford, Charles County, he was a political organizer, a community organizer. And he said to our group, all of us, the BSU, that we can't present 40 or 50 demands to the university. The most we can present to them is 10. And so the writing committee that had taken the initial dialogue, we went back and we clustered all those ideas into 10 themes. And those 10 themes became the 10 demands. What we did in a couple of the demands was that we asked the university to admit and support not just black students, but Asian, Latino, and other ethnic groups. So a couple of our demands speak not only to them making spaces and support available for black students, but also for the other ethnic groups. So everybody in the BSU was active in some committee and working from the time of the assassination until the convocation where the mic was taken, and then the whole BSU was coming together on a daily basis, sorting all those things out and cross-connecting all the work that was going on. It was determined or decided that we would ask people from East Palo Alto to join us, and a large, maybe 30 to 50 people from East Palo Alto came to the convocation. They set up in the front rows with the Black Student Union, as well as other faculty, as other staff, black staff on the university. When Lyman began to speak, and we sat there in silence, began to speak, I'm not sure how much time elapsed between the time he started speaking and our action, but we all stood up and then walked up the stairs onto the stage. One of the co-chairs, Ken Washington, reached out his hand and took the mic from the president, not in a violent or a reactionary way, but in a very respectful but determined way. I was given the mic, and I had been chosen to read the demands. So on the day of the convocation, we met, we talked through what our action was going to be. We helped to make arrangements to get the people from East Palo Alto into the audience, and we acted.
Down the aisle, took the microphone from the president, not with physical force, but they made known that they had some things to say, and they issued 10 demands that then became grist for several days of discussion and negotiation among primarily Dick Lyman and Herb Packer and Bob Rosenzweig. And in the end, 9 of those demands were accepted. And I remember somebody saying at the time, it was either Dick Lyman or Herb Packer, that Martin Luther King's assassination gave the university an opportunity to do what it knew it should have done anyway. And so there was a sense of purpose in moving forward, an interesting political mix of reactivity and proactivity, which I think had a lot to do with the momentum that the university had when it put these demands into operation. I was involved in one of them in particular, and that was to have a special admissions process for minority students generally. And the president or the provost.
The Black Students Union presented the president with a series of demands on admissions. Basically, they would have created a separate black admissions committee. And I was chair of the committee, and to be honest, I was a faculty power type. And I saw that since my committee had responsibility for undergraduate admissions, that we couldn't duck those things. We had to address them. So I sent a note to Dick saying I thought that was the purview of the committee and not a presidential decision. Well, I didn't put it that way, but and he didn't seem to mind to pass it on to the committee.
I'm sure.
We met with both the Black Students Union and, as I recall, it was the Chicano students throughout the year, I reached two conclusions, or we reached two conclusions. One, it would be a mistake to create a separate minority admissions committee or admissions committees, that we should assess the minority students in the context of the majority students. But the second thing was, I realized what outstanding minority students we had. I mean, the people who were negotiating with me, even though I disagreed with them, were really smart. At the end, we concluded, let's go aggressively for the best minority students that we can get. We are not an institution that's strong on remedial training. Let's go for the best.
Well, these clips together tell us about an important variety of stories interwoven that during a time when Stanford begins, at the very beginning, to get serious about admitting more students of color and about creating programs to serve them once they're on campus. Taking the mic was an event that occurred in crises after the assassination of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Student activism is the key here, and it's a continuous theme throughout the history of diversity at Stanford University. Students have been front and center for change, period. And they've played as an important role in 1968 to get Stanford pushed ahead, pushing and struggling, but they were absolutely instrumental. And on the other side, there were people like Ray Bicchetti, one of my dear friends. He's really one of the unsung heroes of diversity efforts for 3 decades long career at Stanford. He was always pushing from the inside, subtly, quietly, but always there. And I really want to praise him. He passed away a few years ago. Now, his comments in that clip, he referred to a period of activity and reactivity. So activity, the students are up in arms. They want change, and appropriately so. And the university is reacting, not always in the way students want, but they are reacting. And some of that is really important for now beginning to push the institution, as Ray said, with a sense of purpose to move forward. Now, there's another person, Artie Bienenstock, in that last clip, and his comments tell us about how the administration hands over to faculty the task of devising an admissions process to recruit and admit more students of color. We are all about process, right? The faculty, the administration is about process. We always create a committee to get something done. In this case, Artie Bienenstock was absolutely essential. He played a fundamental role, not only in thinking about the best approach to recruiting and admitting more students of color. And I think it was really important and the right decision, as Artie mentions in that clip, of going after the best students because over the years, we've had incredible students. So it was the right thing to do. By the way, I am the interviewer for Artie Bienenstock's interview. And I want to also add that Artie, and I hope he's listening today, Artie, I just want to thank you because you were also absolutely fundamental for launching the university's first affirmative action efforts way back when, in the late 60s, early 1970s. And Artie played such a critical role bringing the first cohort of faculty to campus, including yours truly. He's one of those diversity heroes in my history. All right, let's, the next clip, it's video clip number 2. Now this is a different origin story. It's an origin story about Chicano students. And we have Luis Nogales, who played such a critical role in getting things started for Mexican-American students in the late 1960s at Stanford. And a student who was the product of the admission efforts that Luis helped the university create. So let's listen to these 2 clips, and I'll provide a little context.
I arrived at Stanford in around August of 1966 as a first-year law student. Our family were farm workers, and we would migrate from the Imperial Valley to the north all the way to the Napa Valley through the San Joaquin Valley every year, worked in harvesting crops. And we would live in tents, we would live in farm labor camps, and so we were at any one place for maybe a month, 6 weeks, and we were moving on. There was very strict segregation in many areas of our society, and I experienced those as a child. So I had a very clear understanding of discrimination, segregation, lack of opportunity for, at that point, Mexicans. My family, I as a young child, were involved in labor organizing in the fields of the San Joaquin Valley. Got a scholarship, and I went to San Diego State. It was a time where across the United States, clearly in California, the number of Hispanic students in attending colleges and universities was very, very low, less than 1%. I had a very successful time at San Diego State and decided to go to Stanford after meeting the dean of the law school, Bayless Manning, who was introduced to me by a graduate of the Stanford Law School, who was a very prominent lawyer in San Francisco, Frank Tatum. The dean told me how he wanted to have more minority students come to Stanford, and would I come and help him? And so that's why I went to Stanford Law School. And I was sent out, I was authorized, given a budget as a student, to go out and recruit Mexican-American students. That would have been in 67, 68. By that time, I had turned my attention to the broad campus. I put an ad in the Stanford Daily, and I said that all Hispanic students and others who were interested in forming an Hispanic student organization, I forgot what I said then, it was probably Mexican-American, could come to Tressiter Room, whatever. The purpose of the organization was to recruit more students to Stanford. And so at around 7 p.m., I was there, and slowly 1, 2 people began to trickle in. Maybe we all knew one other person there. And I think that altogether we reached the grand number of around 12. And so that was the first meeting officially of Mexican-American students at Stanford. And we later decided to call ourselves MASC, M-A-S-C, which stood for Mexican-American Student Confederation. We started thinking then about our goals, and it was to increase the number of students, Mexican-American students at Stanford. That was our top priority goal. We started drafting position papers for a rationale as to why the university should do this. And there was an associate provost who took great interest, and that was Ray Becchetti. And we started a pilot program for admitting Mexican-American students, undergraduates and freshmen. I remember Ray Becchetti and I visiting a number of schools. We admitted into a pilot program, I believe it was 10 students. I still remember a lot of those students. After that pilot program, we kept advocating for a much broader program. We had a list of demands, and it was to admit 100 freshmen, Mexican-Americans, to hire Mexican-American in the admission office, in counseling, in the dean's office. Those were our first goals. Eventually, the university agreed that they would do this. And I remember that the admissions office went out and they couldn't find sufficient candidates. So we proposed that we would put up a recruiting campaign. And so I put together a team of 10 students. And basically it was sending these students back to their home state and to their area to visit all the high schools and come back with candidates. And they just went to those schools, and it was very convincing because they said, I'm Mexican American and I'm a student at Stanford and you can go there too. And it was very credible because they were students. So they came back with applications. I don't think we admitted 100 the first year, but it was close to that.
When I was a junior in high school, there was an outreach effort at Stanford to try to find the first Stanford Latino class, which was going to enter in 1969. And they sent recruiters all over the country. There was a gentleman here at Stanford who was vice president. His name was Luis Nogales. And so Luis Nogales came from Calexico, which was a community on the border in Imperial County. So he decided to send a recruiter into Imperial County to go to his high school and recruit Latino students from his high school to come. That recruiter stopped at my high school. Luckily, one of my teachers felt that I would be qualified to get into Stanford. And so she pulled me out of my junior class, even though they were only talking to seniors, and pulled me out of my junior class and said, you need to listen to this recruiter because he's going to talk to you about a university that I think you should consider going to. And so that's how I got exposed to Stanford.
Luis Nogales was a trailblazer. When he arrived at Stanford Law School in 1966, the number of minorities and women could probably be counted on your hands, your fingers, and your toes. In 1966, I started UCLA, and out of 27,000 students, there were 50 Mexican Americans and 100 African Americans. So I know what he experienced back in that period of the 1960s. Luis's story is about the start of the Chicano student movement at Stanford and the role he played in leading the Mexican American Student Confederation. But importantly, his background. He tells us about his background. And it reminds us of how Jaime Crow, as I call it, the Mexican American version of Jim Crow that had hampered and oppressed African Americans in the South, how Jaime Crow pervaded almost every aspect of your life from birth to death, especially if you were a farm worker in the California Central Valley. Luis's story is the parallel story to the BSU and an effort to increase the number of students, in this case Chicanos and Chicanas, as we began to call ourselves in 1968. It's a tale about student activism and the university's response to requests and sometimes demands. It's also a tale about not knowing where to start in the admissions process for Mexican American students because the university had not thought about these students before, despite the fact they were the largest minority in California. It is the part of that story that those of us that write about Chicano and Chicano history, Mexican American history, refer to as the era of the forgotten minority. It's also the rise of the Chicano movement at Stanford, at UCLA, and at institutions across the Southwestern United States. Now, well, isn't it interesting that Jose Padilla, another friend and colleague of many decades, was a product of the efforts by Luis and other members of the Mexican American Student Confederation, later named MECHA, the Chicano student group, by 1968. And he, by chance, went to a presentation of Chicano students who had gone to his high school, and to encourage him and others to consider applying to this place called Stanford. He'd probably never heard of the institution before. But what's amazing about that is that for those young people that came into the university and those that have gone throughout, and you heard it in the stories in the opening clip of our two African-American alumna, the opportunity that it creates. And higher education, once it opens up for people like Jose, like Luis, like for me, it changes your life chances. It changes your career. Jose went on to a distinguished career as director of the California Rural Legal Assistance Program. And Luis had an amazing career as an attorney in television and motion pictures in Los Angeles, and later named a trustee of the university. And then Luis, if you're out there, muchas gracias, amigo, because you set the foundation for what would later come for Chicanos and all students of color at Stanford, together with other students of color who, like you, were committed to Stanford and making it a better institution. By the way, if you're interested in reading more of the origin stories about Chicanos and Latinos at Stanford, I want to tell you about a book that's going to be available next year from one of our alums, Frank Sotomayor, who's a distinguished award-winning reporter of many years for the Los Angeles Times. He will be publishing a book, many of the chapters which I've read. You don't want to miss this if you're interested in this origin story. The title is The Dawning of Diversity, How Latinos Helped Change the Face of Stanford, 1967 to 1974. So get a hold of that book. It's going to be an interesting read. Our final set of clips are interviews with several people, alums, faculty, staff, all commenting about the development of student services for a growing number of students of color at Stanford. The common theme is how Stanford had to adjust to incorporating more students of color into the student body and providing them the places and the programs of support to help them transition to campus life and to feel a part of the Stanford community. So with that, let's run the final clips for our diversity of Stanford undergraduate students.
One other thing I wanted to say about those times and the institutional learning that went on with this. We were all very naive, idealistic and naive. And one of the evidences of naivete was that we thought that diversity and integration were sort of one and the same thing, that if you just admitted students, everything else would take care of itself. And we very quickly learned that everything else didn't take care of itself. That this was really a white institution in terms of its norms and mores and the expectations and the backgrounds from which the students came and where they got their hair cut and all of those sorts of things. And so we finally realized that, whoops, we really have to, this won't work. And we were helped to realize it by a lot of the minority students who said, we need our own assistant to the president, we need our own center to gather. That grew into ethnic dorms as a place where you can kind of go home and relax. You don't have to be on 24 hours a day, so to speak, trying to prove yourself. So as these things developed, Stanford became more and more genuinely integrated.
Casa Zapata is interesting because, in fact, the first faculty involved was an engineer, a colleague of mine, Doug Wild. And this was a total experiment. It had been suggested trying to organize theme dorms along ethnicity lines. And Doug volunteered for this in 1970, I think was the first year. He did it 2 years, and then Pacheco showed up, and Arturo Pacheco became a resident fellow. But it was a very tumultuous time because nobody had done this. The students so it was 50% ethnic, 50% Anglo, and none of the Anglo students wanted to be in that dorm at the beginning, and so they were basically would apply through the system. It was kind of a lottery, and they were appointed, and so there were major issues the first 2 years that they had to begin to sort out. Arturo Pacheco came in I believe 1972 as the resident fellow.
And he built a home for them. Before the Chicano Cultural Center, Centro Chicano, that was the hub, right? So he not only had the students living there, he was mentoring them, advising them, and being father to them as well.
And they're attracting other students there too. They didn't live there.
Exactly.
Right.
All the cultural events before El Centro Chicano took place, as you recall, in Casa Zapata.
I had been selected as a sponsor in Branner Hall. I experienced not only living in the dormitory system at Stanford, but now was really part of the counseling staff responsible for a group of freshmen myself. One of my real interest was to see that the dormitory system, which was so fundamental to the life of Stanford undergraduates, had a place that could be used as a base for allowing more diverse Asian Americans to feel comfortable at Stanford and live within it. I wrote a long memo that I submitted this document to the housing office to propose an ethnic theme house for Asian Americans. The adjustment curve for students who were not used to the sort of upper middle class norms practiced at Stanford were really, really hard. And it's not just a function of race or ethnicity, although I think that compounds it, but it had a lot to do with class and the comfort level of transitioning from small towns or inner cities or all of that kind of background and coming into the fast track, as it were, of this place. Having a dormitory where one could be oneself, one could ask questions comfortably without risking ridicule or embarrassment, where it was legitimate to want certain kinds of foods or to have certain kinds of values expressed, and have a safe zone for that seemed to me to be very, very important.
Students were a very important force on campus, and there were a lot of things that came into being because of student advocacy and effective student advocacy. The BSU was there. As far as African American students were concerned, there was a whole group of what we called institutions. So now I'm kind of moving into my staff hat. Campus Black institutions, African and Afro-American Studies, the Committee on Black Performing Arts, Ujamaa, the Black Theme House dorm. There was a strong African American alumni group that frequented institutional events, and the Black House, which was sort of the hub, that was the home of the Black Community Services Center, and it also housed the BSU. And so all of these institutions were the sites of either student participation or student advocacy, or students felt that their efforts to make the campus environment more responsive had created these institutions. And so there was this fervor about protecting them and making sure that they survived.
I feel like the Black House was like home. Yeah. Mm-hmm. It was home.
You could stop in whenever, someone was always there. You catch up with whoever was there. And we didn't have phones and things back there. So that was like the central location for people would just descend there. Like, you know, like you went back to your mom's house. The Black House was home, and you just had some free time on Friday afternoon. You went to the Black House and just saw who was hanging out in there.
Yeah, there or Uj.
Yeah, or in Ujamaa. Yeah, that's true. Mm-hmm.
And then Jan. We talk about Jan a lot. Mm-hmm. She was there, and if she was there to help you whenever you needed help. Mm-hmm. And then also, it was a place where they organized tutoring. So I remember, coming in. Your freshman year is a bit of a shock, and we were both engineering majors to start. The Black House organized tutoring, and so I remember that being really important at that point too, and putting us into little study groups and giving us a tutor or grad student to help us with different subjects.
For those that have grown up surrounded by an extended family and a community of people from their tribe, it's difficult. It's like, okay, now I'm surrounded, and not only are there no people from my tribe surrounding me. There's one over in that dorm and one in that dorm, and I see them here at the center, but day by day, I'm by myself. Or it's not like home. Our students know that there's a place for them here. They're welcome here. They have the combination of the keypad on the front door, and so they can come in any time of the day or night. They're here, they're studying, they're visiting, they have their student organization meetings here. And if learning from grandmother wasn't important to them before, it may become important to them here because the heightened awareness. Say some student says, well, I'm 1/8 Navajo and I grew up in Sunnyvale, and now I'm meeting for the first time Navajo people. I'm feeling related to you, and now I want to know more about my culture. So those are the kind of things we like to see happen here.
All of those clips from interviews that speaks so beautifully and so wonderfully about how the institution responded to make Stanford a place for students that at previous generations had not been on the Stanford campus. So it is part of a history of institutional change. Now, Ray Bucketti's comments were so frank and on point. He said, we, quote, "we were all naive. We thought diversity and integration were the same thing," end quote. While he and others learned quickly that they were not, and there needed to be institutional responses to allow students of color to feel that they belong. Nelson, I think, said it absolutely perfectly and plainly. It wasn't just about race, it was about culture, and it was about class. And so when you have students coming from communities that had not been, these are the first generation students, and a place like Stanford could be so alienating. But the university, and I have my hats off to the administrators over time and the students that were pushing for change to create those resources, those places, those institutions that would make Stanford a multiracial, multicultural community for a diversity of its student body. Now, the panel of Chicano faculty, reflecting on the creation of Casa Zapata and the role that this theme dorm had on students, that was a critical stage. It was important because you had to create a residential context for students so that they could ease in, they could feel a part of, they could feel comfortable, they would have a home. But believe me, that was not always an accepted proposition at the university, because routinely, almost every 10 or 15 years, the idea of ethnic theme homes were challenged, but they usually compelling arguments were made to really argue why they were such a fundamental part of a diverse Stanford student body. Now, going back to Nelson's comments about the formation of what became Okada House when he was a student activist and later as a staff member, or later as a trustee, reminds us about the continuing influence that students had on services they believed the university needed to create for them and others. Now, Professor Harumi Befu was instrumental as the first resident fellow of Okada House, as was Arturo Pacheco, as the Chicano faculty pointed out, for Casa Zapata during the 1970s, and for him into the 1980s, and later followed by resident fellow Burciaga, Cecilia and Tony Burciaga. Now, the clips from Faye McNair Knox and Denny Woodward, again, dear friends of mine who I have enormous respect for, offer comments as staff who provided essential student-centered programs and places on campus for students of color. Faye described the importance of the Black House as the home for the BSU and other groups, and how Ujamaa House served similar roles as the other theme dorms, but for African Americans. Now, these programs fostered student activism and agency, but served as a safe place of comfort and nurturing. And now, as we look back to generations of students, and this is attested to by the comments of Stavoni Patterson and Angel Martin, who were members of the class of '99, they look back and see how important in their lives as students that they were able to have a place where they felt comfortable amidst all the other parts of student life at Stanford, but those were critical things that put them on a platform for success, taking opportunity and converting that into productive citizens and leaders in our society. Now, Denny Woodward provides similar reflections on how Native American Community Center was a home, almost, as she describes, and I got to see this firsthand, I'll tell you a story just very quickly, almost family, away from family. And for so many Native students over the years, it was a place to connect, to feel comfortable, to seek out support, to get resources to help you with your coursework, culturally to connect, to understand other Native students from other tribes that people had not had any interaction with before. So here's the quick anecdote. I had some Native American students, and they were the first Native American students I had ever taught, late 1970s. And when they found out I had played basketball at UCLA, they had formed a basketball team. And they asked me to join that team, and I did. And we almost won the intramural championship at Stanford. I was a young guy at that time, of course, about 32. But what I learned from them was how important it was for them to see other Native students, relatively small in number, and how the center built community. It created a safe place for them. It allowed them to feel comfortable. It gave them a sense of belonging. And that's what this history of institutional building, diverse institutions within the larger Stanford community was all about. Now, let me conclude by saying that, again, we're incredibly indebted to the Stanford Historical Society and its oral history program for its work in generating and preserving fundamentally important sources for telling these stories about Stanford and its people over time. I urge you to support them. They do not have institutional long-term support. They should. And the more of us that say, Stanford, this is an absolutely essential part of what you need to do as an institution to build the resources, to tell the stories and some of the untold stories about the institutional history of our university. So thank you again, Natalie, and all the people, the Stanford Historical Society, past and present, and the oral history program in particular. Now, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ann Arvin, who will take us into part 2 of the program. Hope you enjoyed the first part.
Thanks very much, Al. It's just such a pleasure to be part of today's event. Just beginning, as Al did, to reflect a little bit about the Oral History Project. I was struck by the fact that when we think about our institution, we work with a different lifetime, so to speak. The university's lifetime we mark by centuries and centennials, but our much shorter time that is encompassed by an academic career of a faculty member. So as I was looking at these vignettes, I thought that really what the oral history program does for us and what is so invaluable is it reduces that institutional history to a truly human scale. And we've already seen that. I think you'll see that in these clips that I'm going to show you. But what we see is really the lived experience of people who were here and in many cases are here, and in their own words, what opportunities they saw, what obstacles they encountered, and what changes they were able to make as faculty in their roles as educators and scholars. I think that from their collective voices, we learn what it really takes to sustain the education and research missions of the university in a way that we wouldn't otherwise. So to put this part of today's program into a historical framework, I thought I would quote from a sentence from the founding grant, and this is 1885 we're talking about. And it says in the wonderfully straightforward language of that document, the institution should assist by experimentation and research in the advancement of useful knowledge and in the dissemination and practical application of the same. That's pretty clear. So today, I think these oral histories are going to highlight for you how this purpose of advancing useful knowledge has been shaped in particular through a longstanding commitment to interdisciplinary research at Stanford, as well as by the decision to move the School of Medicine to Palo Alto in 1959 as a faculty of the School of Medicine. I certainly think that was a brilliant idea. So talking about interdisciplinary research, my own connection to this history, as Natalie mentioned, is the time that I spent as vice provost and dean of research. And in that role, a very important and to me, very rewarding part of the job is to be the cognizant dean for Stanford's independent laboratories, centers, and institutes. So this began late 2006, and that was at the time that then President John Hennessy was looking to enhance research across the disciplines
through the Stanford Challenge. So that's where I came into the story. But what I think you'll find out is that this vision was really moving forward from a solid foundation. And that's because of the foresight of Stanford leaders in 1982, which is when Al Hastorf was provost. So what happened then that mattered so much now is that this group of leaders established an institutional structure. And it's important to realize that these structures can really have a profound effect. And so that's why I'll dwell on it a little bit. They, first of all, defined that this structure would consist of formally organized research or scholarly programs which involve faculty members from more than one school. So they defined already this way of doing scholarly work that would bridge across the disciplines. And they also, and this language I think is really prescient, they were specifically intended to promote collaboration and to break down barriers between traditional areas of study, to solve complex problems at the intersection of various disciplines. And they took that to be, and again quoting, essential in the search for solutions to significant global and societal problems. So that was their vision. The structure that they devised, I think, was also extremely important in the fact that it enabled faculty to engage in interdisciplinary programs based on their interests, while they were also to maintain their discipline-based departmental activities and responsibilities. So in this structure, it wasn't a matter of having to choose. That was really important. So how this played out in the 1980s, we saw the structure being used to create institutes that focused on policy relevant research. So this goes not just lab science impact, but much broader. And so those included the Stanford Institute for Economic Research Policy, SIEPR as we know it, Institute for International Studies, which is now Freeman Spogli. Those were established early on. And then in the 2000s, we saw how this approach was really just as robust for establishing BioX. We'll hear more about BioX in our program. And then subsequently the Woods and Precourt Institutes, and 3 institutes that have strengthened Stanford's ties to SLAC, which has been very important in enabling cutting edge research. So then most recently, this history, this structure has played out with our new neurosciences and ChemH institutes. So that is a brief overview. And now let's begin. First, I'll tell you a little bit about what you'll hear, and then we'll hear these stories about the origins of interdisciplinary research at Stanford and about the School of Medicine move. So in these segments, you'll hear Bob Beyer, who's going to trace the origin of the cross-disciplinary center concept earlier than the 1982 mark I put there, to the 1950s, when there were large government projects that were beyond the scope of a single department and needed an alternative structure. David Hamburg is going to recall for us the School of Medicine when it was in San Francisco and the critical role that was played by Wallace Stirling, whose vision it was to relocate the school to Palo Alto. There's a wonderful segment from our Nobel laureate, Paul Berg. He is describing how the move of the School of Medicine actually attracted Arthur Kornberg and faculty from the biochemistry department at Washington University in St. Louis, and attracted them to come here and create an incredible Department of Biochemistry. Some interesting facts that we learn are that, in fact, Arthur Kornberg insisted that the department be recruited. So this was is not what is typically done to recruit en masse a department like that. And also how his relationship with Henry Kaplan influenced all of these events. So with that, let's take a look at these clips.
Can you say, what is an independent laboratory?
That's a Stanford invention that now has been copied and rediscovered by more universities and people. It was created out of the physics department as a way to try to manage research projects that might be larger in scale than an individual lab in a small building could be. And so the Hansen Experimental Physics Lab, which is the current name, was originally founded as the microwave laboratory, as a dream of W.W. Hansen. His idea was the government could sponsor the laboratory scale research program of a joint research of a number of faculty with a shared interest, and it would be easier to manage that shared research interest in a productive way. During my term as Dean of Research, there were reasons that we split the lab into Hansen Experimental Physics Lab and Ginston Lab. The Hansen Experimental Physics Lab became focused on NASA-sponsored space-based larger scale missions. So,
How have the independent laboratories affected Stanford?
They were recognized quite early as being something special at Stanford because they allowed multiple schools and multiple departments to do joint research in an area of common interest. We had an external panel review the laboratories. Ray Weiss was the chair of that panel. And Ray came away saying, you know, MIT needs to do this now. We need this kind of structured MIT. We don't have it, and we're missing it badly. He said, you guys do things we can't possibly do. You work across engineering and science as if there's no boundary there. We don't do that. I can't do a joint project with a mechanical engineer like a Dan DeBray, but we can. And so they recognized that interdisciplinary research was really an important thing to learn how to do and to build it into your structure so that it was part of what you did without having to reinvent it all the time. Now, it's been reinvented at Stanford too, rediscovered would be the way to say, more than once. And so the Hennessy administration spent a lot of time talking about interdisciplinary research.
They were in the process at that time of moving the school from San Francisco to Palo Alto. The situation in San Francisco had been that the clinicians were preoccupied with their practices. They didn't have much time for teaching and hardly any time for research. So it was a very good kind of school of its kind, but it was not what I was looking for. I was looking for a place that put a lot of emphasis on research and where there were the rich interdisciplinary possibilities. But I was tremendously impressed with Wally Sterling, with whom I became later a close friend. He had the courage to make the move. Wally saw the huge possibility of having the medical school together with the rest of the university. He knew the university was great in the hard sciences and the behavioral sciences, and it was great in physics and strong in engineering, great in chemistry. So he thought, my God, if you could develop biology, which we hadn't done very much of up to that point, and you could get this whole gamut of the problems that medicine touches on, you could have the greatest university in the world. There were very few universities that had a close connection between the medical school and the rest of the university. He saw that opportunity and had the courage to see it through, including raising the money. It was a very difficult proposition, and nobody expected it from him. He had not been a scientist, he had not been a great scholar, but he had a vision. He had a vision.
When the move was planned, one of the first things that was planned was to actually build up the basic sciences. Now, biochemistry didn't exist as such. The medical students doing their preclinical years down here, actually took biochemistry from a chemistry professor. The urging of Henry Kaplan and Avram Goldstein, they settled on approaching Arthur Kornberg. Now, Arthur Kornberg was, I think, at the time, probably considered in the top 5 biochemists in this country. So it was a plum that they were going for. Arthur Kornberg had been recruited to Washington University to become professor of microbiology. He was the head of that department, but there was no other faculty. And so he spent about 2 or 3 years recruiting an entirely new group of faculty. We were all biochemists or structural biochemists. None of us were microbiologists. Arthur Kornberg was invited to come and make his recruiting visit, to give a lecture. And I remember him telling me before he left, when we were in St. Louis, he said, I am not interested in moving. I've just built up this department. It's going to be a great department, but I have to go because my good friend Henry Kaplan has urged me to at least to show up and consider it. He came back very enthusiastic about what was happening at Stanford. The move into these new facilities right on the campus with a lot of very interesting scientists already in place in the chemistry department, in the biology department. And so when he came back, he was a changed person. He was very enthusiastic. He said, I will not accept this appointment at Stanford unless you all come with me. All meaning all of the young assistant professors he had recruited to the department. So we had many, many evenings over beer and food and snacks discussing should we not. And ultimately we all agreed that it would be great for each of us to come to Stanford as well. There was a ferment. The whole feeling was that this was an exciting new development. Stanford was stepping out to do something that was unusual. And here was an opportunity for us to come as a unit, and I'll amplify that for a moment, and be part of that new process. So what was unique? Unique was that a department of 7 people flourishing at Washington University in St. Louis moved en masse, all 7, to become the new Department of Biochemistry.
All right, I can't imagine a more vivid description of those events, those origin events, so to speak. And so then what happened next? In the next clips that we're going to look at, we are going to learn about the launching of the new initiatives for interdisciplinary research that John Hennessy and Provost John Etchemendy envisioned. As you can imagine, that didn't happen seamlessly, and there was a lot of thought put in to the whole process. So we'll hear from John talking to David Kennedy as he explains what kind of a process that he was looking for, which is an important point, is that he was looking for one that would end up such that the end was at Stanford was going to be bigger than the sum of its parts. And you'll hear him talk about that. I have some comments there talking a little bit about the importance of allocation of resources and how that can so much influence through pilot project grants and through fellowships that are co-mentored, how something that is envisioned becomes an actual reality in supporting interdisciplinary research. And the last segment is Charles Kruger, who's telling us about the origin story of BioX, and especially a particularly important insight that he had, which was that we needed to build buildings that had people from different disciplines in proximity, next door to each other within the building. And that's the now very widely imitated Clark Center concept. So let's hear those clips.
You set up something, if I remember the title correctly, the Provost Task Force on University Priorities, which set the template and the foundation for the the Stanford Challenge campaign that followed.
Correct. Interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary work was increasing. Stanford, because of its broad strength across the disciplines, could have a unique opportunity to do some really incredible things. And I remember early on to the trustees, I said, we're looking for a process where Stanford at the end is going to be better than going to be bigger than the sum of its parts in its impact and what it does. So we started with those faculty planning committees because that's really where any academic planning, that's where the expertise lies. And you've got to do, and we picked faculty who we thought would be forward-looking in terms of their disciplines and their directions, but who would be collegial and who could make those kinds of, see those cross-disciplinary opportunities, but would also be willing to try to say, okay, here are the highest priorities. And that process, I think, brought us to a really good set of insights about what we should do, right? And particularly environmental area, building up the arts, which really came out of that. Out of that, we could shape, with the input from the deans and getting the deans to work together, something that really was a coherent plan for the university that had some clear flagships in it.
So you use the word flagships. In my mind, I think of the flagships have the names FSI, Woods, and BioX. These centers take on a lot of weight in the ecosystem of the university, and they're not wholly, synchronous with or friction-free in their relations with the traditional departments. How do you manage their relationships?
How do you manage the relationships with departments? We wanted both quality control that the departments have traditionally done, but we also wanted these new efforts to pull the departments in important ways. Pull together, let's say in the environment with the Woods Institute, pull a set of departments that had research related to issues of sustainability in the direction of trying to focus greater on the issue of long-term sustainability of our planet. We didn't want the institutes to separate from the departments. We wanted them to collaborate. And it's a balancing act. I think it's one that works well because we can do a joint appointments at Stanford. If you were an institution that didn't have joint appointments as part of its quiver, instead of a matrix organization, which is more or less what we have, you would set up things that were parallel to the departments. And then the tension is even larger in many ways. So there's a monetary competition as well. That we're now more than a decade into these, and I think they're working pretty well by and large.
John Hennessy put resources on the table so that the institutes would be able to have essentially matching funds for recruiting. That made it possible to kind of leverage the opportunities to search for somebody who was inclined towards interdisciplinary research and yet who by definition had their own discipline. So John's vision put resources on the table that would incentivize building the interdisciplinary programs.
How does somebody get to be an independent lab?
It was made a very straightforward by Stanford policy that was actually written in 1982. Al Hasdorf was the provost then. And if you look at that policy on establishing independent lab centers and institutes, it is fantastically forward-looking. It describes really a structure that works. And there's a list of criteria there which are absolutely the right ones in my view, and how they were so creative. First of all, it has to be built around a set of issues and challenges that are expected to be of long-lasting challenge. It's got to be by those criteria of interest to faculty from multiple schools and departments. Certain very cross-cutting types and areas of research, you need everybody. I, as Vice Provost Dean of Research, spent a lot of time in meetings with colleagues from around the country. And of course, it was a time when many universities were working towards creating these kinds of interdisciplinary institutes. And the question was always, well, how do you change the university structure to get people to realize that not everything has to be done within a department in a school. And so I always felt very lucky to be able to say, here's the policy from 1982. We did not have to invent a new structure. Where there was opposition, it was possible to say, well, this has been done for the last 20 plus years, for example, with CPR. It's really works, and it's not going to undermine the departments. And that history really made it so much easier for us.
BioX, like a lot of things that have been successful, there are a lot of people that will say, it was my idea. And I suppose I'm one of them. I remember going to some kind of event at the faculty club. There was a break, I think, and I went over, and Jim Spudich and Steve Chu were talking about how they had brought their labs together in collaboration. Steve is a physicist, and Spudich is a medical school faculty member, and came out of this that maybe we should organize some way to encourage that to happen at Stanford. And we realized that even though the medical school was closer to the other faculty, you still didn't have people working together. And so the idea came of forming an organization and a place to have things happen. And that led to the Clark Center, of course. If you have the physical structure and organizational structure of BioX, you not only encourage planned interactions, but you make possible interactions that are accidental. People get together, say in the cafeteria. They may sit next to somebody who has a different background and talk about what they're doing and find out there is some reason to carry that a little farther. That's sort of one of the ideas behind the physical configuration of the Clark Center.
So there you have some really vivid stories about how things evolved from that very original structure and idea that really set Stanford apart in how we were able to respond to the developments of ongoing interest in interdisciplinary research. Before we go to the next clips, I realize we are creating something of a historical record here today, of course, and I wanted to go ahead and mention another really important benefit from the interdisciplinary institutes, and that is the commitment of our external advisory boards, who have been playing a really important role in the successes of these programs, because they bring their expertise and their perspectives from beyond the university and help us make these interdisciplinary institutes have impact that they might otherwise not have. So the next clip, we're going to hear from Jim Plummer, who is going to tell us about another type of institutional change that can emerge and can break down disciplinary boundaries. And he'll describe the origins of the Department of Bioengineering as a story that encompasses those kinds of change and have had, again, tremendous impact. So let's hear from Jim.
The development of the bioengineering department in 2002. Can you maybe use that as a little bit of a case about what you're describing on how you get these disciplines to cross?
So it is an interesting story, and it started long before I was dean. And so when John was dean, he convened a study group, and I'm sure when Jim Gibbons was dean, he had a study group. And the question was, what, if anything, should Stanford do about being involved in this biotech revolution? Rightly or wrongly, the conclusion I came to was the following. If you look at all of the existing engineering departments at that time, and ask what are their scientific underpinnings. They are physics, mathematics, and chemistry, and not biology. And so you say, well, that's interesting. I mean, why is biology not an underpinning of engineering departments in terms of how they think about problem solving and everything else? And if you think about that a little bit, then it's not hard to come to the conclusion that physics, chemistry, and mathematics are quantitative sciences. You can write equations, you can develop models, you can predict the results of experiments in all those fields. And so engineers can use that kind of scientific understanding. You know, they can design an engineered system, and it'll work. You know, because the models that come from physics and chemistry and math are solid. The deep understanding is there. Then you could convince yourself, and I guess that's what I did, that that biology was going to get there, and the developments in the human genome, the developments in understanding cellular function, the scientific basis of life, and so on, all that was going to lead, you know, sooner or later to the kind of quantitative science that math, physics, chemistry has provided for a century. So I got convinced that if that's even partly true, then we need somehow to bring biology as a science base into the School of Engineering. And I didn't think that was going to happen in our existing departments. Then Phil Pizzo arrived at Stanford as the medical school dean. Phil and I hit it off like that, and we saw the world the same way. It turns out we're exactly the same age within 2 days. So we learned this about each other. We were both runners and so on, so we had a lot in common to talk about. But we convinced each other that it might be worth thinking about a department which was jointly managed by the medical school and the engineering school. So we sort of floated this idea, and you know, these things never come to convergence in a university environment unless you push it. Phil and I convened an off-campus 1 or 2 day retreat, and we invited 20-ish faculty from med school, from the engineering school, all the players that have been involved in this, and we just basically said, we're not leaving this room until we have a plan that we are all agreed on and excited about. And what came out of that was an enthusiasm for exploring this joint department between medicine and engineering. Phil and I went and talked with Hennessy and Etchemendy about this and presented this plan to them, and they were bubbling over with enthusiasm. If you've got 2 deans that are interested to try something really new, you got a bunch of faculty who are willing to do it, even if it took us a lot of time and effort to get there, then maybe it's worth trying.
Well, as it goes without saying, that Department of Bioengineering has been a huge success. And so we'll finish off with some clips that carry on that theme of success. And we're going to get some perspectives from Carla Schatz and Helen Blau that illustrate interdisciplinarity in action at Stanford. And I won't miss the opportunity to say that when Stanford went way out on a limb by hiring Carla, Helen, and me as tenure line assistant professors in the same year. I think there's probably a historical society story there. In any case, Carla is a world-renowned neuroscientist. She was recruited back for those remarkable abilities, but also to direct BioX. So she's going to talk about that, and especially how these interdisciplinary institutes can function as incubators and the transfer of technology. Helen's discoveries about the basic biology of cellular reprogramming and the functions of muscle stem cells have been paradigm shifting. And so she's going to tell a little bit about how interdisciplinary approaches have informed her work and the environment at Stanford that has contributed to those advances.
So BioX is agnostic about the field. We support all kinds of things that are welling up. I mean, you could imagine the theme of the microbiome, themes of data science welling up, neuroscience welling up. So what we like to think of is that the building is a home for collaborative interactions and also for incubating. It incubated the Department of Bioengineering, for example. That was the first incubator. That was so wildly successful, it moved out. But not everybody moved. And that's interesting. Same thing is true now for the Neuroscience Institute. There are people like me and others that are not going to move into the new neuroscience building. That would be a disaster. Then we just make another silo.
Right.
So this building I see as a kind of incubator, and it needs to have many different disciplines represented in the building, almost like, since it's called the Clark Center, I call it the Noah's Clark Center. It's, it's sort of the ark where you have two of everything in the building. And it should stay that way. And I think it's very hard to do this. It's much easier. It's just much easier if you're just working on a single discipline. Then we create resources that have to do with making new technologies that have been discovered by BioX members and Clark Center members available quickly to our community before you can buy them off the shelf. And again, to make it so that the building doesn't seem like a silo, but rather it's a place that people also feel they could come to use resources. We have something called the Optogenetics Innovation Lab, which is an amazing lab that teaches a new technology of controlling the activity of cells by genetically putting into those cells a photopigment that's like what's in your eye that takes light and transduces it into a chemical signal in the cell. So you can make the cell do what you want by shining light on it. They're a very powerful research tool in many fields, and at the moment, they're also being used in clinical trials to see about restoring sight to blind people who have retinal blindness. It was invented here in this building by Carl Diceroff, who I hope someday will get the Nobel Prize for this work. Carl is an amazing person, and he will tell you, in the spirit of being part of BioX, is you invent, you perfect, and you share. And he's an amazing example of that. And we helped him to do it by creating a space in this building where he could train people from all over the world, but also Stanford students and faculty, and not have to.
Extension of what we first found, and so gratifying. It shows that you can change the cell's function and potential. What's missing now is a mechanistic understanding of how that happens. And so I've gone back to this old tool of cell fusion to understand the cascade of regulators, the network that lead up to this shift in pluripotency. And I think we have a unique chance to discover those underpinnings. So I'm working with some of the best bioinformatics people here on campus in the genetics department, like Anshul Kundaji. And again, I'm learning through this multidisciplinary approach, and my team of young people, students and postdocs, are so bright and creative. We're making wonderful strides. I also am really interested in taking this idea of bioengineering further, bioengineering niches, so that we can understand stem cell function and enhance the function of stem cells through understanding their microenvironment, the external signals that impact their function. And I'm really interested in rejuvenation strategies. Maybe it has to do with getting older, but I want to understand how to rejuvenate cells and rejuvenate function. And we've come up with new ways to extend telomeres. Telomeres are the protective caps on chromosomes, and they get shorter as we age. We've developed a method now in the lab for extending telomeres, reverse that clock on aging. And this will have tremendous utility, I think, for using cells. So having the close proximity enhances the chances of collaboration and multidisciplinary research. So the medical school in close proximity to engineering, artificial intelligence, chemical and bioengineering, that's a great attribute of Stanford.
So with that, we are completing our oral histories about interdisciplinary research at Stanford. And I hope that you've enjoyed being an eyewitness to this history as much as I have. What it ends up meaning for faculty is that Stanford is a wonderfully collaborative place to carry on research and scholarly work. And with that, I will let Natalie resume the program.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Arvin, and thanks to everybody. We're running just a little bit over, but please stay with us for the Q&A, and please enter your questions now for our panelists using that icon at the bottom of the screen. And while you do that, I want to just take 1 minute to say something about the Stanford Historical Society. Programs like this one are only possible because of the generosity of those who join the society as members or who make gifts to support it. We have about 800 members now, but we really need to increase that number to keep our programming going. So you should join so you can be a part of creating this amazing oral history archive that we've given you just a glimpse of today. With your membership, you help to preserve these unique voices and stories for generations. And we're building something really priceless that I think the University of Tomorrow will benefit from. And we do have a special incentive for you today. If you join by December 31st, you'll receive an invitation to an Introduction to Oral History Interviewing virtual workshop. It's led by me. It's for members only. If you're already a member, just make sure you're current and you can come too. We'll give you the tools that you need to start doing oral history in your family or your community, and maybe even as one of our program volunteers. So please join as a member. If you're not a joiner, you can make a one-time contribution. You can go to our website to learn how. All right, we're ready to go to the Q&A if Professors Camarillo and Dr. Arvin can join us. Let's see what we have. A nice comment from Marie Earle, who's giving the program highest praise and is really appreciating the curation of the clips. And I want to thank Emma Frothingham for doing a lot of work in the archives, finding us some great pictures. Let's see, we have a question about how to find oral histories. Someone's interested in the movement program interviews that were about the activism. You can go to the Stanford Historical Society website. There's a section called Discover History, and there you can find the oral histories by project or by searching for a name, and you can access the recordings or the transcripts from there. If you need help, you can always email me at oralhistory@stanford.edu. Okay, let's see. We have a question for Dr. Arvin, which is about faculty members who want to get into interdisciplinary research. I mean, do you have any advice for how you can be a good interdisciplinary researcher?
Well, I think what I was trying to end up with there at the end is that I think being a faculty member at Stanford, you can barely avoid it. I remember hearing one graduate student say to another, you know, I'm really not quite sure what department my faculty PI is in. And that's kind of what we want. And I think our faculty, one of the things that we hear constantly as we're recruiting faculty is that we make it so accessible. And that's because we have, again, leave it to some wise thinkers, an institutional structure that makes it not a choice. You go to the institutes that you're interested in, and it can be more than one, and you are not in any way becoming less a part of your department as a faculty member.
All right. Okay, and then I see a follow-up to that question. Are there any downsides to interdisciplinary research? Do you have critics out there who say that's not the way you should do it?
Well, the concern is not to undermine the disciplines, but I think, as I've tried to say, and as we heard from John Hennessy and others, the point is to make sure that people are strong in their disciplines. You're not a good interdisciplinary researcher if you're not bringing your deep knowledge of your discipline to the table. And so that's one thing. The other thing, John mentioned the balancing act that goes on between institutes and departments. And I've, in my experience, referred to that as a creative tension because I think it is creative. And as John said, the two kinds of environments for doing research and education really do play off each other and shape each other in ways that this matrixed organization seems worthwhile, even though it does take attention.
All right. Now we have some questions from Frank Sotomayor, who's in the audience, and he offers some thanks for the program, but also wants to know from Professor Camarillo, in your experience, do subjects of oral history tend to exaggerate their stories and achievements? Do they seem to be truthful to you?
That's an excellent question, because it's not a fail-safe kind of methodology for the historian. In fact, you have to use oral history testimony and corroborate it with other evidence. So if someone says something took place at this meeting on this date, are there newspaper accounts, articles that would either validate or invalidate or somehow change that perspective? So as best as the historian can do, you take that oral history testimony and you see as much of it that you can validate and use it as one of many sources. It's not the only source that you would use, but it's one of many tools that historians and others use.
Okay. So Michelle Marinkovich asks, have either of you, either in listening to these clips tonight or in working with oral histories in your work, have you run into any surprises as you've worked with oral histories?
Well, let's let Al do that, because I'm a novice. This is my experience, and has been a creator of this kind of work. So let's hear from Al.
That's a good question, Michelle. Hello. I found that oral histories can augment, they can elaborate, but in some cases for topics unknown, and when I started in my field of research on the study of race and ethnicity in America, and at the local level, that sometimes oral histories open up entirely new topics that you hadn't even conceived of, so that they create history, if you will. They become the building blocks of history. And I think that's the most profound thing I've learned about using oral history, not just an oral history from one person. Typically, you have to interview a variety of people on a topic to get a sense about that subject. But the opening up of altogether new topics, it's what's really fascinated me over the years.
Yeah, and I would agree. And I was just thinking about the clip that we heard from Dr. Satterwhite, who was involved in the Taking the Mic protest. If you listen carefully to that interview, you hear some different things about what was going on. The people from East Palo Alto in the audience, the students very concerned about the community and the equality and social justice in the surrounding community. So I think there's a lot of things that are surprising in oral history. Okay, the final question I have is for both of you. You've both been interviewed as subjects of oral histories, and can you just talk a little bit about what the experience was like to be on that side and giving a testimony for oral history?
Well, I was fortunate to be interviewed by Natalie herself, and I was apprehensive, as I'm sure many interviewees are, but she made it feel so comfortable and just possible to talk about things in a way that would be really interesting to then reflect on after you've been interviewed. Oh, I hadn't really thought about that for decades, so it brings things to the surface in a way as the interviewee that I thought was really quite rewarding.
Well, for me, in the interview that was taken about my career at Stanford and really about my life in a broader context, I was, even as a practitioner of oral history methodology for now 45 years, I was struck by the utter professionalism in the approach to providing the background, the questions, knowing something about me, things that I may have even forgot. They said, oh, back in 1972, you did this. So I said, oh, I haven't thought about that in 35 years or 40 years. But it was the The best oral histories are conducted from a basis of knowledge and preparation. And I can tell you right now that the Stanford Historical Society's oral history program is totally professional. You're not going to get a better kind of interviewee and interviewer than our own program.
Well, great. I think that's a pretty good note to end on. So I want to just thank everybody tonight for attending Revealing History, Voices from the Stanford Oral History Collections. I'd love to have everybody give a big virtual round of applause for our panelists, for our interviewees and interviewers who collaborated on these wonderful stories, and for everyone who helped out put together this event tonight. We'll be sending out a post-event survey via email, so please let us know what you think. We really do value your opinion. You can visit our website to access all of the interviews in the collections, register for upcoming events, and view other online content. So please help us keep oral history at Stanford alive by joining the Society today. All right, everyone, have a great evening. Thanks for coming.